Welcome back to Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. Really pleased to have one of the more frequent guests on our show, Alasdair Macleod, with us once again. And for those of you who aren't familiar with him, I must tell you that he writes a weekly column that is a must-read if you really care to understand what's going on underneath the surface in the economy, why things are happening the way they are, at goldmoney.com. Goldmoney.com, Alasdair writes every week, and there's a couple of those articles we want to talk to him about today. Thanks for joining me again, Alasdair.
That's my pleasure, Jay.
Always good to talk to you, and I do want to talk to you about a couple of articles you've written the last couple of weeks. Irrational Fears of Deflation, I think, was written the last week of January, and then the most recent one, Estimating the Shape of the Coming Crisis. Those are a couple of things I'd like to get you to talk about today. But before we get to that, I did want to congratulate you and your fellow British citizens on voting to depart the European Union. Could you take just a moment to let our listeners know why you think that's a good thing for Britain?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting because this is actually my second independence celebration. Uh-huh. The first was when I was a teenager in Kenya, when Britain gave Kenya independence. Uh-huh. And now we've got independence from the EU. Hooray! Uh-huh. So I'm an old hand at this. But no, the good thing about it is that we're no longer tied into the regime of protectionism in the EU. This is obviously from the trade point of view. Mm-hmm. We now have between now and the end of the calendar year, in other words, December the 31st, to negotiate the terms of trade. The point being that we are already out of the EU. Mm-hmm. And so this interim period, if you like, is going to be quite important. The EU isn't going to be ready to start negotiating until April, because the negotiators have to consult with all the member states to get their agreement on their approach. But they have already given us an idea of how they're going to tackle this. Meanwhile, Britain now has a government which is not frightened of world trade terms. Mm-hmm. You'll hear the description that ideally we want Canada plus, which is free trade, basically, on our current terms. Or alternatively, the Australian model. And the Australian model basically is WTO terms. So, in other words, we really don't mind one way or the other. And I think there is a recognition, certainly by Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, who's his chief advisor, and also Michael Gove, who is de facto deputy prime minister, that free trade is actually what we really want. And their objective is for Britain to lead the world in returning to free trade. So in a sense, we're going against, if you like, American policy aimed at China, and American policy as it will be aimed, I guess, at the EU.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we'll look forward. It's a very, very interesting development, certainly, and one that's not just occurring in Britain. It seems to be a desire to sort of separate from the larger body politic in a number of places, right? And various countries within the EU are also kicking up their heels a bit. And, of course, we had Donald Trump here as well. It all seems to be more for localized politics and where people have more control of their own destiny, I guess you'd say. And
yes, I think members of the EU are more upset with the mm-hmm. impositions upon them from Brussels. Mm-hmm. For various reasons. I mean, the Italians, for example, continually want more money, and when they don't get it, they scream blue murder. The Germans have the problem that their savings are being trashed all the time, so they're unhappy as well. It's not a happy ship. They've got different reasons, but actually very few of them are interested in free trade. This is something that is essentially a British approach to trade.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get on to the topic of today then. Irrational Fears of Deflation, an article that you wrote, and then after that, Estimating the Shape of the Coming Crisis. I would perhaps like to start out by asking you to define Your definition, I believe, is an Austrian school definition of inflation or deflation.
Yes, well, inflation, quite simply, is an increase in the quantity of money in circulation. Mm-hmm. Deflation is the reverse of that. But obviously there are, if you like, there are symptoms that arise from changes in the quantity of money in circulation. Assuming it is imposed on the people by the state, inflation obviously leads to a lower purchasing power for each unit of currency in circulation, which commonly we express in a rise in price inflation. Mm-hmm. Deflation leads inevitably to a tendency for prices to tend to fall. But you needn't actually have much deflation you needn't even have any deflation in the quantity of money for prices to fall over time. And this basically was the situation in the 19th century for Britain, when prices fell over the whole period from really the aftermath of Waterloo to the First World War. Not only did prices fall, but the quantity and variety of goods over that period expanded very, very substantially. And another key element of that time was they did away with tariffs, and we had free trade. And that meant that this country, with minimal government intervention, became the most powerful nation in the history of mankind. I mean, more than the Roman Empire in terms of its extent. Mm-hmm. The Industrial Revolution that we saw was really quite remarkable, and it depended on people being able to create wealth for themselves and keep it and build on it. And of course, the socialism after the First World War has gradually destroyed that. And essentially, inflation is something that suits government. It does not suit you and I as ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably the best way at looking at deflation, and why deflation has got such a bad name. It's got a bad name from inflationist economists who basically want to inflate the money supply for government to, if you like, tax you without you really understanding that you are having your money debased by their exercising their seigniorage.
Right. No, we certainly saw that. The governments, they how does it happen then, Alasdair? You know, you talk about this, times were pretty good. And did you have then this egalitarian, the income distribution during that period of time that you're talking about? How was that? And because, you know, we hear stories of poverty and you know, in the literature and so forth about, you know, all the poor people and the Industrial Revolution during the people that, the children that were working in factories and so forth. That's sort of what we hear about all the time, why you had to have government stepping in and making rules and taking over things, right?
Well,
there does seem to be some justification for it at times, it seems.
Yeah, the myth about that is you're comparing, and this is something everybody does. They compare the time of Dickens, you know, and little boys being sent up chimneys and all the rest of it with today. And obviously, you know, we've progressed since then. And the idea of going back to that is horrendous, of course. Yeah. But the real comparison to make is what existed before the Industrial Revolution. The answer is basically subsistence and nothing else. And the Industrial Revolution, plus, and particularly the removal of tariffs on corn, on imported corn, which meant that corn prices fell, food prices fell. It meant that people had, you know, not only could they go and work in a factory and earn some money to pay for their bread, their daily bread, but they also had a little bit of a surplus, so they could go and buy clothes, they could buy other things, and that led to the construction of more factories to satisfy this demand. I mean, yes, there were some very wealthy people, but the living standards of the ordinary person improved immeasurably over that period. So the idea that deflation is bad for you know, the lower classes or the disadvantaged is baloney, quite frankly.
Well, I guess it's that the average people probably don't make the connections between the free markets and their well-being. It certainly isn't taught in our schools in the United States. If anything, our people are being taught that socialism is the way you get the way you do better, and certainly the government runs all the schools in the U.S. Even the universities, the private universities, the government has its heavy hand in what is taught, and the professors that are teaching it are all far left of center of anything close to free market economics. So people seem to be taught, the propaganda seems to have everybody believing that government must get involved. Huh?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, the whole thing about socialism is that somebody else, will provide for you. And, that route eventually leads to bankruptcy. And, I mean, we can see that the effect, if you like, of the accumulation of debt, which will never be repaid, is testament to the fact that pursuing that course eventually ends in the most appalling crisis. And that's really where we're headed. And this is a subject I know you and I have discussed, and I'm sure you have discussed with a lot of your other, the other people that you've invited onto your show. The point, I think, the simple point is that inflation is something that governments want, not what you and I want. What you and I want is a better standard of living and lower prices, as long as lower prices do not threaten our ability to earn. And that is something that is sorted out by free markets without any difficulty whatsoever. I mean, if you have pure free markets, you don't have unemployment.
Alasdair, in your article, you say it's preposterous to think that deflation can take place at a time during a period of accelerating monetary growth. And I would ask you, though, 2008, 2009, we certainly saw a very brief period of deflation, I think. Price collapses across the board pretty much because of the debt implosion. So is it your contention that you won't see that for any length of time, or that you can't see it at all?
It's my contention that you won't see it for any length of time, and that was proved by the time that you refer to.
Yeah,
I mean, prices did fall because suddenly we had this enormous financial crisis. There's far too much production going on, which was only justified by increased consumer debt, if you like. And when that sort of suddenly was threatened, manufacturers started just basically dumping inventory because, they needed, if you like, to have the cash rather than inventory. So, yes, prices were cut. But that was a very, very brief moment. And so far as I recall, it didn't really last beyond about 2 or 3 months. In reality, I know it lasted slightly longer statistically. But another way to look at it is just imagine for a moment that you're in Germany in 1921, 22, 23. What you see is increased poverty and at the same time rising prices. And it is only around about May 1923 that the average German suddenly realized that what was happening was that the purchasing power of the mark was diminishing. It wasn't a question of prices rising. And it was at that stage that the average German started really dumping money as quickly as he got paid it. So if you were earning, you would get paid in cash by your employer, and you would immediately run out and buy anything, whether you needed it or not, just to get rid of the money. This led to the sort of stories like someone left a wheelbarrow full of billion mark notes outside the shop as he went in, and when he came out, he found the money was on the floor, but the wheelbarrow had been stolen. Dump money for goods. That's the thing. So quite obviously, you had the characteristics of an economy which was failing, which is what the inflationists say deflation is, at the time when the purchasing power of the paper currency was actually collapsing.
Yeah. So we had this brief period of time, very brief as you suggested, only about 3 months. Aren't we perhaps in a position where something like that could happen again?
Well, it could, but it would be very short. I mean, for example, if we have another banking crisis, which I would have thought there's a very strong possibility, then we would get the similar sort of panic. But you and I know what will happen. The central banks, they're already doing it actually ahead of this happening with repos and all the rest of it, and the ECB doing QE, and the Bank of Japan is thinking of doing QE. You know, they're already printing the money to stop it happening. But assuming it happens, we'll have that brief moment of thinking, oh, my goodness me, you know, we must stop buying things, you know, just until it sorts out, or until I'm certain that I've got my deposits in the bank and they're safe. I mean, the interesting thing is that very few people actually have significant deposits in the bank. It's all in the hands of major corporations, large foreign entities, and you know, the providers of credit services. So the deposits are not really the individual. The individual, something like 80% of them are living paycheck to paycheck,
That's
and that
right.
means from, you know, we've got a credit cards to pay on day one, and by the time we get to day 30, we're up to our maximum limit on the credit card. So, you know, they don't actually have any savings. It's just a question of operating within a debt ceiling, which changes the characteristics, I think, of what's happening on the price front relative to money. I mean, money creates an effect on prices. It creates an effect on the psychology of people. And it's the combination of changes in the quantity of money and the psychological impact that actually leads to changes in the general level of prices.
All right, I'd like to quote you in your January 30th article as estimating the shape of the coming crisis. You state, and I quote, estimating the shape, you say, with a recession becoming increasingly certain and the end of an expansionary phase of the credit cycle in sight, we can expect a periodic systemic crisis to be upon us soon. The question arises as to how serious it will be, given that despite the massive injections of extra base money since the Lehman crisis, signs of liquidity shortages are already reemerging in financial markets, end of quote. And I noticed this morning, Alasdair, a couple of news stories that I read. One, it seems as though this repo crisis is not going away. There was a report this morning that the Fed had to inject another $94.5 billion into the markets today. And then I read another article that says banks are tightening credit cards, auto loans, and standard as commercial industrial loan demand is declining. And so banks are also tightening credit cards and auto loan credit. What do you make of that? Those two news items.
It doesn't surprise me, and I mean, starting with the repo situation. I mean, I've got the figures up in front of me, and the sort of the daily rollover. You're looking at $64.5 billion. And looking at the longer term, so we're looking at 14 days and 9 days. That's another $59 billion. Well, that was submitted, of which 30 was accepted. So it is actually increasing now. We'll see what the figure is tomorrow and the day after. But this is something of a crisis, I think. So. There is no doubt that even though the Fed will not call it QE, the Fed is having to inject money into the monetary system in order to stop interest rates rising, which actually tells us something else. With what's going on, interest rates should be higher than the Fed funds rate. That's something which is worth bearing in mind. As to your question about banks tightening their lending requirements and all the rest of it, I would see this as quite natural at this stage of the credit cycle. At this stage of the credit cycle, we are entering the crisis phase. Now, the bankers basically create the crisis phase by no longer being prepared to lend. And that is precisely what we're seeing with the tightening of credit on consumers. What we're not seeing, though undoubtedly it is happening, is they're also tightening on businesses. I mean, I'm not talking about the big businesses, but if you look at the medium and small enterprises, which make 80% of any economy, you will find that those that have a working capital requirement, the banks will be leaning on them, trying to reduce that, or indeed to remove it altogether. So it would seem to me that this is confirmation that we are entering that crisis phase.
Right. Okay, so what should we be doing? I mean, how should we be preparing for this, Alasdair? Because, I mean, the equity markets right now, today, I didn't check since I went on the show, but they were on a tear. Donald Trump has everybody believing that he's the best thing since I don't know what, since,
I mean, isn't that the most extraordinary thing? We have this coronavirus, which is shutting down China, and therefore taking a large chunk out of economic performance overall, the global economy. That is likely to spread to other countries and is showing signs of already doing so. I mean, this is a really serious thing. And what happens? You know, equity markets go through the roof. This, to me, stinks of a combination of enormous investor complacency and government manipulation of markets. I mean, we've seen that the Chinese authorities are trying hard to stop their market from sliding, the Shanghai Composite from sliding. We haven't seen signs necessarily of the US government doing the same, but I believe that they are doing the same. I mean, because they have tied the performance of financial assets to the economic outlook and therefore their currencies. And when you tie these two things together, as I argue later in the second article that you refer to, you end up with the John Law Mississippi bubble situation, where both financial assets and currency collapse at the same time. That is the risk we now face, rather than, let us say, the German 1920 to 23 situation, which everybody, I think, expects.
Right. Well, you know, it's one of the issues that you talk about is the idea that the dollar could lose, that people could lose confidence in the dollars and as the world's reserve currency. And frankly, when I mention that to most people, they think that's the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard. And we don't have time to talk about that today. You and I have talked about it in the past. There's a good scenario, I think, not a good one. There is a realistic scenario in which that could happen. We don't have time to talk about it today. We are basically out of time, Alasdair. Thank you so much for being with us. But people, go to goldmoney.com, read Alasdair's article, and there you'll get the story. You'll understand why these things are the way they are and why you shouldn't count on the dollar being the world's reserve currency forever.